The Falcons are a top 3 destination for free agent quarterbacks, which means they should be able to land pretty much anyone they want.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in all of the world. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Use your profit boost on an NBA future and get entered for a chance to win a trip to the NBA Finals. Play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So if you don't know me, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we are going to continue our ongoing discussion of the Falcons quarterback situation, quarterback future. You know, why I'm just sort of assuming at this point in time that the Falcons are going to bring in a bridge quarterback like either Joe Flacco or Jacoby Brissett. You know, how attractive the Falcons are going to be for these potential bridge options this offseason, and why this current regime under Kevin Stefanski and Ian Cunningham is not going to be necessarily tied down to any of the quarterbacks that wind up being here in 2026. And towards the end of today's episode, it'll be made clear, you know, why it seems inevitable that Tim Boyle is destined to join the Atlanta Falcons this offseason. But you know, this conversation is part of an ongoing conversation that we've been having for several weeks now, but it goes back to last week's episode where we talked about the 3 buckets that the Falcons quarterback options are potentially going to be in. You know, it's the starter bucket, the bridge bucket, the backup bucket. And without rehashing all of that, the starter bucket is basically similar to what the Falcons did 2 years ago when they brought in Kirk Cousins, and that guy is going to be the new starter over someone like a Michael Penix. The bridge bucket is what the Falcons did 2 years prior to that, 4 years ago, when they brought in Marcus Mariota to be the bridge for Desmond Ridder. And, you know, that to me is the most likely bucket that we'll see the Falcons get into. But the backup bucket is what the Falcons did 3 years ago. And I got to keep it all straight, right? When they brought in Taylor Heineke to essentially be the backup to Desmond Ridder. And like I said, I think the Falcons will most likely be shopping in that bridge bucket. And I feel like as we sit here today, and we'll see if this changes over the next, 3 weeks or whatever between now and the start of free agency, it feels like if we're going to make a bet, the safest bet on who that quarterback is going to be, who that bridge option is going to be, it feels like it's going to be Joe Flacco. There's too many connections to this regime. We saw, Kevin Stefanski bring him into the building twice in Cleveland. Joe Flacco was also the quarterback in Baltimore when Ian Cunningham got his start as a scout there in Baltimore, 18 years ago. And I know the idea of Joe Flacco, there's going to be a lot of folks that are not a fan of that, right? And I think a lot of it is owed to there are plenty of quarterback options, but my pushback against that is none of them are really that good, at least in 2026. And, you're going to get a lot of debate and discussion, arguments, yelling at each other about who the next Falcons quarterback should be. And I think a lot of those debates and discussions are going to be based around people coming at it from different places and winding up in different destinations, right? If you're looking for the Falcons to add a quarterback that, can allow the team to pivot off of Michael Penix, or you're looking for a bridge that at least has a little bit of potential to be more than just a stopgap option for, the first half of the 2026 season, then the idea of the Falcons signing someone like Joe Flacco sounds like a terrible choice. Now, if you're looking for someone who's cheap and competent and is probably going to give you the best bang for your buck on a cheap deal, and there are little to no expectations that that player is going to be a Falcon beyond this year, then you're probably not going to find better options than Joe Flacco this offseason. We saw Joe Flacco sign for $4 million last year with the Browns. He had an additional $9 million in incentives on that contract. And I don't believe he earned very many of them because he was only on the team for a month in the regular season. And you contrast that with another guy that I think is a legit bridge option, should he become available, is Jacoby Brissett, right? Jacoby Brissett averages about $7 million per year in his salaries over the last 5 years, according to overthecap.com, right? And so if we're sort of assuming that we could get Flacco for $4 million and we could get Brissett for $7 million, that $3 million in savings is not nothing, right? Now, overall, in a $300+ million salary cap, it's, one penny on a dollar, right? And that doesn't seem like a lot, but, $3 million is enough for the first year cap cost of past Falcons free agents like Charlie Warner, Bud Dupree, Mac Hollins, Cordero Patterson, not necessarily guys that are going to really, really move the needle for your football team and completely change the trajectory of your football team. Although, we'll pound the table for Charlie Warner, Cordero Patterson on this podcast, that it did a lot of good work. No offense to Bud Dupree and Mac Hollins, but that's certainly a caliber. $3 million is enough for you to be able to plug a hole with a decent starting caliber player this offseason. So those $3 million in savings between going with Flacco, makes some sense versus someone like a Brissett or someone who's even more expensive than Brissett. But the reason why I would bet on Flacco versus Brissett is simply the fact that Flacco is definitely going to be available this offseason, and we don't know for certain if Brissett is going to be available because he's technically under contract for the Arizona Cardinals for the 2026 season. Now, a lot of people speculate that the Cardinals can and will cut or trade Jacoby Brissett, and if that's the case, then he becomes available. I think he'll be a legit option. But part of the reason why I'm betting on Flacco is because I feel like Jacoby Brissett will probably have a little bit more of a robust market than Joe Flacco will. And so the Falcons will have to compete less for Joe Flacco's services than they would for Jacoby Brissett's services. And so the question is, if they are forced to compete for any of these quarterbacks, will the Falcons win that competition? I think the answer is maybe, obviously. I can't say definitively for sure, because it's kind of difficult to kind of gauge how the Falcons are perceived, by impending free agents and around the league, right? Whenever people talk about the Falcons, they always talk about, how loaded their roster is. And, we always are a little dubious of those notions, those assertions. But certainly, this team does have some talent here, right? As Ian Cunningham said, the cupboard is not bare, but we got to add more. But you wonder, okay, how attractive is this going to be for some of these free agents? Because, the likelihood in terms of what we sort of are expecting this season, we'll see if this comes to reality. But whoever this bridge quarterback is going to start up to 4 games and then sit the bench for the rest of the year. And there may be other places where that guy's going to get an opportunity to play more if that is the goal of that player. And so with 8 or 9 teams potentially in the market for quarterbacks this offseason, depending on how you want to count it, I can confidently say I don't think the Falcons are number 8 on that list, right? In terms of ranking how attractive a destination they are. But I don't think that also means that they're, number 1 on that list. I would say pretty comfortably, I would probably be confident in saying they're probably 3rd on that list, right? I feel like Minnesota and Pittsburgh, right? If you want to go to more stable situations, right? Or in Minnesota's case, even though you have JJ McCarthy breathing down your neck, you get to throw to Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison for a time period. And then in Pittsburgh, we know that, Pittsburgh, well, we'll see how they are post Mike Tomlin, but based off of Mike McCarthy's history, they'll probably be the exact same team. So, we'll see how stable they are post Tomlin, but that's stability that you don't necessarily get in Atlanta. And so, there's obviously going to be a healthy debate on, what's the most attractive destination. It'll depend on each individual's how they value certain things, weapons, opportunity, stability, all those various things. So we'll see on that front. But it's to be determined on who's going to want to be an Atlanta Falcon this offseason at the quarterback position. But let's talk more about why the Falcons would want someone like a Joe Flacco. And it has everything to do with them being non-committal at the quarterback position. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So wouldn't it be nice if doing your taxes was just as easy as handing the rock off to Bijan Robinson? It is now with TurboTax Full Service. You can hand off your taxes to a local expert and not have to stress from start to finish. Right? That local expert may not be as good at scoring touchdowns as Bijan Robinson is, but they certainly are great at completing your taxes. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms. You can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They're going to handle everything from W-2s to self-employment forms. They're going to work to get you every deduction. All you got to do is upload your documents, go about your day, and you can get updates right in the TurboTax app. It's a huge time saver, and it's going to give you real peace of mind knowing that an expert is handling it, just like you get that peace of mind every time Bijan Robinson steps on the field. So for a limited time, get your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life by visiting turbotax.com/local to book your appointment today. So I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. You, the everydayers, are the reason why Locked On is now the #1 sports podcast network in all of the world. And the offseason doesn't exist for everydayers that are part of the Everydayer Club. You can join the Locked On Podcast Network Discord to talk Falcons year-round and get every episode of the show ad-free. Head on over to lockedonfalcons.supercast.com or hit the link in the show notes below to find out more. So let's talk about why the Falcons would want Joe Flacco. And, this is maybe going to be controversial to some of you guys, but I think part of it is just kind of like Joe Flacco and Michael Penix have a lot of overlapping skills in terms of what type of quarterback they are, right? They both are big arm quarterbacks. They both can be aggressive throwing the ball down the field, right? They both don't necessarily have great mobility, right? Now, obviously, Penix moves a little bit better than a 41-year-old Joe Flacco. We hope, but that's not going to be something that is really a strength of their game. It's just going to be like, oh, you can do enough to get by. Right. And then, Flacco is decently accurate. By no means is he's like a pinpoint accurate quarterback. He's always been kind of average in terms of, starting quarterback standards in terms of accuracy rankings and whatnot. And to me, given Penix's concerns with accuracy, getting to the Flacco level of like average accuracy, where you're not sitting there going like, oh, he's, terribly inaccurate or anything like that, is kind of the end goal in terms of what you can realistically, develop Penix into, in my humble opinion. So in a lot of ways, that version of Joe Flacco that, maybe not the version that you will be getting in 2026, but maybe the version that you were getting maybe 10 years ago, is very similar to what the type of player that you want to turn Michael Penix into. And, bring that guy into the building and say, hey, Mike, watch what this guy does. Now, we know Joe Flacco is famous or infamous or however, depending on your perspective on it, for basically saying, I'm not a mentor, right? He basically said last year in Cleveland with the rookies there, he's like, look, I'm going to lead by example. I'm not going to be a jerk about it or anything like that. But like, my goal is not to necessarily take these guys under the wing. I'm here to win, right? And shout out to Joe Flacco for still believing in that Browns team and that Browns roster and his ability to win games in Cleveland. You got to have that type of confidence if you want to be a successful NFL quarterback. But, Penix doesn't necessarily need a mentor. Now, one wouldn't hurt or anything like that, but he had Kirk Cousins for 2 years. Right. And we talked about this last year with, all the drama and the fallout from the Caleb Williams situation in that last year under Matt Eberflus before Ben Johnson's arrival there. And it just felt like, Caleb Williams was kind of twisting in the wind. And, regardless of what you think about the previous coaching staff led by Raheem Morris, they did not do that with Michael Penix. Right. You could certainly criticize some of their things with handling Michael Penix, but they did not set him up to failure by basically not having a veteran in the room that he could emulate, right? They didn't throw him to the wolves, with stakes tied around his neck, or throw him to the sharks without a lifeline, to sort of save him. And, when you can contrast Flacco's, attitude towards mentorship versus, say, a Jacoby Brissett, Brissett seems to be a little bit more open to being that mentor, being a little bit more willing to take ownership and responsibility for being a quote unquote good teammate, being that helping hand for a young quarterback, at least based off of his public statements that he made in regard to Drake May back in 2024 when he was there as the bridge quarterback to May in New England during his rookie season. And so either way, I think when you're approaching this bridge quarterback situation, you're looking for a guy that can kind of be, and face is maybe too strong a word, but kind of the, the face of your team and your offense for the next 4 to 6 months, starting in April when the offseason begins, that can take those first team reps and, get this team ready to play week 1 in September, throughout the offseason and be ready to go if his number is called. Right. And we say 4 to 6 months because, the offseason begins in April. The timetable for when Penix is supposed to return, and we'll see how this plays out, but it's supposed to be August. So, April to August is 4 months. And then in theory, if there's a little bit of a delay there on Penix's return and you need that guy to kind of play you through October or whatever, you have a guy in the building that can theoretically do that. Right. And then I think the other thing that really sells you on betting on even these short-term options like a Brissett or a Flacco is that they're short-term bets, right? You're not expecting this arrangement to go beyond 2026, nor should you, right? The Falcons get a clean slate, should they need it, in 2027, right? Because if you're Kevin Stefanski and based off of what you went through in Cleveland, allegedly, right, where you seemingly had little to no say in who your quarterback was throughout the years. Even with the, I read something earlier today where like Kevin Stefanski's reaction to finding out about Joe, he didn't want to trade Joe Flacco, right? He was like, okay, well, we got to figure this out because someone above me decided to trade for Joe Flacco last year to the Bengals, right? And so, whether we're talking about Deshaun Watson or whatever, but, he didn't really, it sounds like from all accounts, he didn't really have that much say in who the quarterback was. And it was just kind of his job to make it work because people above him, the GM, the owner, were like, here's our new quarterback. And it's like, okay, I guess we'll figure this out. And so if you're Kevin Stefanski and you're coming to Atlanta, like you probably want to have a little bit more say, right? Maybe you don't want to have all the say, but you probably don't want to go back down that road again where you have little to no say. And so being tied down to, a quarterback at this stage, whether we're talking Michael Penix, whether we're talking one of these bridge options, it's just a year, right? It's just like, hey, man, let's tread water for year 1. And then we'll pivot to Penix at some point in 2026, see what he's got. And then we'll potentially have a chance to pivot again in 2027. Now, if I'm sitting here betting who's going to be the week 1 starter in 2027, I think Penix is the best bet you can make at this point in time, but I certainly wouldn't bet the house on that. It's really the only bet you can make at this point in time because he's the only, real option that the Falcons have, right? But if you're, if it's Penix versus the field, we might wind up taking the field at this point in time, but we'll see. We'll see how that plays out, right? Again, we'll have a better idea of whether or not we're making a bad bet in that regard, 2-3 months from now than we are sitting here today. And, as we sit here and talk about Kevin Stefanski being incentivized to go out there and find his guy at some point in the near future, or potentially in 2027, whether that's recommitting to Michael Penix or going get another guy, we can have the same conversation with Ian Cunningham, the new GM, right? What's the main reason why Ian Cunningham is the general manager of the Atlanta Falcons right now? It's probably because the Bears drafted Caleb Williams, right? The Bears under Ian Cunningham and GM Ryan Poles, they inherited Justin Fields. That was a selection from our guy, Ryan Pace, former Falcons, VP of player personnel. And, they spent the first 2 years in Chicago trying to make Fields work, right? And then they kind of lucked their way into Caleb Williams. And I say luck just because very few people saw that 2023 Panthers team being as awful as they were to allow the Bears to get the number 1 pick that they had traded the previous year when they had the number 1 pick. And could have taken Bryce Young or could have taken CJ Stroud or anybody else at the top of that draft, but decided to stick with Justin Fields and managed to get Caleb Williams. And I say that because, like, if the Bears had only won 8 games this year, right? Like many people probably thought they would. I think I predicted them to win 8 or 9 games this year going into the season. Would Ian Cunningham be currently the general manager of the Atlanta Falcons? Probably not, right? If they weren't a successful team, but they were very successful. Now, again, it goes beyond just drafting Caleb Williams. You got to give him a good offense to support him, as Ben Johnson was able to do. And I don't even remember who the OC was. Was that still Getsy or was that somebody else? I can't remember. Oh no, it was Shane Waldron. That's who it was. Yeah. Ooh, rough. Forgot about Shane Waldron. But basically the point of all that to say is finding your guy is so critical to your success as an organization, as a head coach, as a general manager. And both Stefanski and Cunningham come from situations where they inherited a first-round quarterback from the previous regime. Stefanski made it work for a year with Baker Mayfield, and then it stopped working. And then things went downhill after that point. Cunningham and the Bears inherited Fields. They tried to make it work for 2 years. Eventually they pivoted and something better came along. And I think the same thing could happen here potentially in Atlanta with Michael Penix, where you try to make it work with Michael Penix. If it works, great, right? This year's going to be that big, important evaluation year that we've constantly been harping about on this pod for the last, 6 weeks. And if it works, then great. If it doesn't work, then you get a clean slate in 2027 and you can go get your guy. And so I think that's what attracts you to some of these short-term options as opposed to trying to make something, work where you're like, oh, this is the guy that we want to tie ourselves to. It's like, I don't feel like I have to explain this, but like, there's just not a good option. Like when, again, Malik Willis, sure. But like, you're really betting your future and your coaching tenure on like 4 starts, for Malik Willis, where he looked reasonably good in 4 games. Like, all right, again, if you're willing to do that, more power to you. But I don't see that happening for this regime. And so it's just like, you just try to tread water and then we'll see. And so, we'll spend a lot of time trying to figure out, who that bridge quarterback 1/2 is that will allow the Falcons to tread water. But, the reality that we haven't really talked about is that the Falcons probably going to need to add at least 2 quarterbacks this offseason. So let's talk about their potential options and avenues for adding that second quarterback who's going to be the third arm into the mix. And we'll do that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, have you ever wanted to experience the NBA Finals live and in person? Well, FanDuel's going to give you the chance to turn that dream into a reality with their NBA sweepstakes. Here's how it works. Use your profit boost on any NBA future, and you automatically will be entered for a shot to win an NBA Finals trip for 2. That's right. Flights, tickets, the whole experience. And if you're already looking at the board and thinking about which team that you feel confident can make a deep run, this is the perfect time to lock it in. We love futures this time of year coming off the All-Star break. You pick that team that you feel like, hey, I think they can make a run to the championship or to the conference title. It's going to add that extra layer of excitement for every game down the stretch. And not only can you now win cash by making that pick, you could also win a trip to the final. So visit FanDuel.com to get started. Use your profit boost on an NBA future and get entered for a chance to win a trip to the NBA Finals. Play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So I'm expecting the Falcons to add 2 quarterbacks, at least 2 quarterbacks this offseason. Now, we don't expect Kirk to be back, right? We thought, a month ago you would have asked me, like, there's a decent chance Kirk coming back. Now it's like, probably not. We'll see. Right. Again, there's going to be 8 opportunities elsewhere out there for Kirk to land a spot. And the odds are in the favor that he'll pick one of those other opportunities over the Falcons. But again, top 3 job. So Kirk, think about it, Kirk. But, I don't think there's a lot of incentive for the Falcons to re-sign Easton Stick. So, we're looking at really just one quarterback on the team. And as I'm aware of it, the Falcons, Emory Jones, I saw a report on Twitter or something like that they cut him or something like that, but I think he was an exclusive rights free agent. So we'll see. I'll get some clarity on that in the future. But Easton Stick. Let's talk about Easton Stick. He was a warm body. We'll always have that Lions preseason game. Such a beautiful moment, and he'll go down in the Locked On Falcons lore as one of the great preseason quarterbacks in Falcons history. Right, and that sounds like an exaggeration to many of you, but everydayers know. It's been a rough decade for preseason quarterback play in the city of Atlanta. So, hey, Easton, appreciate you, my guy. But, he was a warm body. It makes sense for this new regime to bring in their own warm body. We'll call that the QB3 because Penix and whoever we're talking about, the bridge guy, whether it's Flacco, Brissett, or somebody else, we're going to take the 2 top spots. But there's going to be potentially 4 to 6 months of this offseason until Penix is back where this QB3 is going to be the QB2. And there's certainly a world where this QB3 might wind up having to step in for a time as a QB1, because what happens if the bridge guy gets hurt in training camp, right? And we're at a point where we're weeks or months away from Michael Penix coming back. And, that incentivizes the Falcons to not just basically go out there and just, pick a random dude off the street. But, I don't expect the Falcons will try to invest significant resources in this QB3. We'll probably get a free agent signing that makes close to veteran minimum, or we'll get like a day 3 draft back. We talked about, Drew Aller as an option in round 7, because on Mock Draft Monday earlier this week, when our guy Josh Kindle of The Athletic did a mock draft that had the Falcons taking him in round 7. Go check out that episode if you want to get more insight into that specific selection. But, I expect the Falcons to do their homework on the quarterback class this year. And if they do like a guy in this draft class, I wouldn't be shocked at all if they take a flyer on one of those guys in the late rounds. Now, we talked about on that Mock Draft Monday episode earlier this week that there is a pretty low hit rate when it comes to quarterbacks taken after round 4. You're more likely to get, a Sean Rimfree or DJ Shockley, for those of you that know your Falcons draft history, as not so recent Falcons examples of late round picks that never played a snap for the Falcons or never threw a pass for the Falcons outside of a preseason game. Those are pretty typical outcomes for those late round quarterbacks. But, I also think the Falcons could look at some veteran options as well. And especially when we talk about that backup bucket of quarterbacks that they could be looking at, they could be exploring that bucket to potentially find some cheap guys willing to play on the close to the veteran minimum. I'm looking at guys like Jake Browning, Trevor Siemian, Kenny Pickett, Hendon Hooker are some of the names that have connections to this regime. All of them are impending free agents. Hooker, I think, is an exclusive rights free agent. But with Tanner Engstrom out the door in New York, who coached Hooker in Detroit and then at the end of the season in New York, I'm assuming that they're not going to tender him and he'll be an unrestricted free agent. So he'll be available if the Falcons are looking at an option. And then, of course, it comes to Tim Boyle. He's another person to note. Currently unemployed Tim Boyle. He has connections to Engstrom from his days in Detroit, as well as Ian Cunningham from a brief stint in Chicago back in 2022. And we bring up Tim Boyle because where would the Falcons be right now without Tim Boyle? Right? They owe him a favor for all the good that Tim Boyle has brought to this Atlanta Falcons team. And if you don't know what I'm referencing, I'm talking about 21 game with the Lions where Tim Boyle started and nearly beat the Falcons and threw a pick in the final seconds to Foye Oluokun to seal that win. And then a 23 game with the Jets where Tim Boyle, I think, threw 2 picks in that game and then missed a wide open touchdown to Garrett Wilson. Or he didn't pull the trigger on the throw. And that was the main reason why the Falcons beat the Jets on that particular Sunday. So we owe it to Tim Boyle to kick his tires at the very least. So I feel like they got to bring in Tim Boyle as their QB3, at least to come in and compete, because he's done so much for this franchise over the last, 4 or 5 years. But, I expect the Falcons to carry 4 quarterbacks on their roster entering training camp. It's going to be Penix. It's going to be that bridge. It's going to be whoever that QB3 is, Tim Boyle or somebody else. And then we'll see who that 4th arm is going to be. Could it be another veteran? Could they double dip on veterans? Tim Boyle, Jake Browning, competition for QB3. Incredible in the preseason, right? So is a veteran. Is it a draft pick? Is it an undrafted free agent? I would probably bet on an undrafted free agent being that 4th arm, but we'll sort of have to see. So this is, going to be fascinating how the Falcons approach this quarterback situation when we talk about this team's future. One of the reasons why it's harder for me to be as optimistic as other people are is not simply because I hate the Atlanta Falcons, although I do hate the Atlanta Falcons. I'm kidding, guys. You watch this team every single Sunday and tell me how you feel about them. But, it's hard to be optimistic about the Falcons just because so much is TBD, to be determined when it comes to the quarterback situation. And without stability at that position, solid play at that position that you can expect, game in and game out, it's going to be really hard for this team to reach whatever you think the goal should be, whether that's winning the division, making the playoffs, making a deep postseason runs, winning Super Bowls, whatever, right? It's going to be really hard to do that if you're not getting at least significantly better quarterback play than what the Falcons have been getting for the better part of the last half decade. So it goes back to a conversation we had a couple of weeks ago where it's like there's a black hole of mediocrity that just keeps sucking the Falcons in, that gravity well. They can't escape that gravity well until they really solve the quarterback, and that's going to be the boost, the rocket booster that's going to allow them to escape the gravity well of the black hole, if you get my drift. So we'll see if the Falcons can achieve that starting this offseason, and then future off seasons. Goes back to a conversation we had where someone asked you, what's the thing that Kevin Stefanski needs to do? He's got to figure out the quarterback situation. That's the biggest thing he has got to figure out. It's not the only thing, but it's the biggest thing. And so we'll see on that front. But that's going to end it for us here today, guys. Tomorrow, or our next episode, I should say, depending on when you're listening to this, we're going to start talking about, some of the top free agents that the Falcons have. And we'll start making a case for and against, why the Falcons could and should or would bring these guys back. And we're going to start, with our guy, Tyler Algier, right? We haven't spent a lot of time talking about Tyler Algier since the end of the season. So let's talk about him on our next episode. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so that you don't miss that episode. Check out Locked On NFL if you're looking for more, info on what's going on around the rest of the league. And if you want to get more info on the Everydayer Club, especially for those of you that never miss an episode, the Everydayer Club is built for you. Get Locked On Falcons ad-free, plus a members-only Discord access and so much more. All you got to do is head on over to lockedonfalcons.supercast.com to join the club. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, guys. Your team every day.